Sound tears the silence before light does. Sirens one atop another, creating a harmony of panic that seeps through the concrete walls of the Strategic Command Center. Inside, the air is frigid, yet faces are slick with sweat. Giant screens flash with red dots moving in impossible, erratic, deadly patterns. Men and women in crisp uniforms rush about, shouting jargon and coordinates that only amplify the confusion. At the center of it all, General Louis Lambert, a man whose posture seemed carved from granite, is now fraying under the pressure. His eyes, once sharp and commanding, dart from screen to screen, seeking a logic that isn't there. Where did they come from? The satellite picked up nothing. He bellows, his voice, usually a thunderclap of authority, now sounding brittle. Damage reports, now. A young analyst, Sophia Carr-Keller, pale as a ghost, looks at her own screen, where an old, archived, ignored simulation overlays the unfolding chaos in real time with chilling accuracy. The red dots of the attack follow the spectral lines of the prediction with terrifying precision. She stands, her voice trembling. General, Dahl's plan. It's happening. Exactly as he said it would. Every target, every moment. The chaos in the room seems to freeze for a microsecond. All eyes turn to Lambert. The general's face contorts into a mask of shock and pure denial. The memory of a stammering young analyst, trying to explain that very pattern in a report he'd tossed in the trash. Hits. Him with the force of a projectile. How could this be? Where are you listening from now? It doesn't matter. This story is about the sound of silence and the voices we choose not to hear. Subscribe now, because you won't want to miss what happens next. From a very young age, the world was too loud for my son Luka. His mother, Helena Kuznetsov, recounts, her voice carrying the echo of 1,000 silent battles. Not the noise of the streets or the television. It was the noise of people, the expectations, the looks, the questions that didn't wait for answers, only for compliance. Luka Dahl grew up in a world not built for him. To others, he was the quiet boy in the corner, who didn't make eye contact and whose words, when he tried to speak, tripped over each other, caught in a stutter that made others look away out of impatience or embarrassment. To Helena, he was a universe of wonder. She remembers finding him at 6 years old, lying on the living room floor, surrounded by every map she could find. He wasn't playing. With a concentration bordering on the sacred, he traced with his finger the routes of commercial flights, ocean currents, railway networks. He didn't see lines on paper, Helena explains. He saw systems. He saw how one thing connected to another. A delay on a train in Berlin, he'd tell me, could theoretically cause someone to miss a flight in Tokyo if a series of other small things happened. To us, it was a curiosity. To him, it was the fundamental logic of the universe. This unique perception was his gift, but also his prison. At school, his teachers labeled him slow or uninterested. They saw a boy who didn't raise his hand, who cringed during oral presentations. They didn't see the mind that solved complex math problems in his head, simply because the shapes and numbers danced for him in a way words didn't. Helena waged a silent war for him. Meetings with principals, conversations with psychologists, sleepless nights researching how she could help her son navigate that ocean of misunderstanding. They wanted to fix him, she says, a bitterness time has not erased. They wanted him to stop stimming when he was excited. They wanted him to make friends the right way. They wanted him to speak without hesitation. They wanted to erase everything that made Luka, and every attempt of theirs was like a small cut into his soul. Luka's father, a good but pragmatic man, struggled to understand. He needs to be tougher, Helena. The world won't adapt to him. It was a phrase spoken out of love, but it sounded like a sentence. Helena's outburst wasn't against her husband, but against the world he described. Why not? Why couldn't the world bend a little to accommodate such a brilliant mind? Luka's adolescence was a fortress of silence. He found refuge in computers, in the purity of code's logic. There, words didn't matter. Syntax was king. His fingers flew across the keyboard, building systems and programs with an elegance he never found in speech. He could construct digital worlds where everything made sense, where every piece fit perfectly. Outside the screen, the world remained a puzzle with missing pieces. His dream, he confided to Helena one night, was not to be a soldier. He hated violence. His dream was to protect people, the country. not with a weapon, but with his mind. He saw vulnerabilities in systems everyone considered secure: power grids, communication networks, supply logistics. He saw the cracks no one else perceived. And it was this vision that led him to apply for a special data analysis program for the Ministry of Defense. It was a chance to use his gift for something greater, to finally be understood in the language he mastered, the language of patterns. Helena felt a mixture of pride and dread. She knew he was more than capable. His mind was a strategic weapon any nation would be lucky to possess. But she also knew how that world worked, a world of hierarchy, of rigid postures of direct, unyielding communication, a world where a young autistic boy who stuttered would be seen not as an asset, but as an anomaly. She helped him prepare his resume, train for the interview. She watched him put on the mask of normalcy, an effort that exhausted her just to witness. He got in. He was accepted. And for one brief, shimmering moment, Helena allowed herself to feel hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, the world was finally ready to listen to her son. Initial hope shone like neon in a gray hallway. In the beginning, in the strategic analysis department, Luca Dahl was a kind of silent prodigy. They handed him raw, chaotic data sets, intercepted enemy communications, satellite imagery, movement reports, and he transformed them into clarity. His reports were works of logical art, heat maps, predictive models, network analyses that revealed enemy intentions weeks before they became actions. His immediate superiors, like Major Amir Smith, were amazed. They didn't care that Luca wore noise-canceling headphones all day, or that he needed 10 minutes of absolute silence before starting a new task. They didn't care that all communication was via email, concise and direct. What mattered were the results, and Luca's results were impeccable. For the first time in his life, he felt his brain was not just accepted, but valued. That feeling was like taking a sip of fresh water after a lifetime of thirst. But this bubble of acceptance was fragile. As his insights became more crucial, he was pushed outside his comfort zone. Pure analysis wasn't enough. He needed to sell his findings. He needed to participate in strategy meetings, high-level briefings, and that's where the neon light began to flicker. The first major presentation was a disaster. The room was filled with high-ranking officers, men and women who exuded a confidence Luca never understood. The air was heavy with the smell of strong coffee and the pressure of time. He approached the podium, his perfectly organized slides projected on the screen behind him, and then he opened his mouth. The pattern indicates. An awkward silence descended on the room. Some officers looked away, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. General Louis Lambert, who presided over the meeting, scowled, his impatience a palpable wave of force. Luca felt the panic rise in his throat, a tight knot strangling his words. He knew exactly what he wanted to say. In his mind, the explanation was clear, elegant, irrefutable, but the bridge between his mind and his mouth had collapsed. He pointed at the screen, trying to use gestures to compensate, but his movements were stiff, unnatural. "Just give us the summary, Dahl," Lambert said, his voice sharp. "We don't have all day." The humiliation burned him. He managed to stammer out the main conclusions, but the nuance, the beauty of his logic, was lost. After the meeting, Major Smith pulled him aside. He was a kind man, but a product of the system. "Luca, your work is brilliant, but you need to work on your presentation. Be more confident. Look people in the eye. Fake it till you make it." It was the most useless and painful advice he could receive. It was like telling a man with no legs to simply walk more confidently. The "fake it till you make it" was the belief that his pure talent would be enough. The harsh reality was that in that world, packaging mattered more than content. If the truth wasn't delivered in a package of charisma and authority, it was discarded as garbage. Things worsened. Luca, in his literal honesty, pointed out flaws in senior officers' plans. He didn't understand the political game, the need to soften criticism. If a plan was flawed, he'd say, "This plan is flawed. The probability of failure is 87.3%. This wasn't seen as helpful analysis, but as arrogance from a strange junior analyst. General Lambert began to see him as a problem. A brilliant analyst, yes, but socially inept, and therefore unreliable. Lambert was an old guard man. He believed in chain of command, in respect for hierarchy, in men who looked and acted like him. Luca was the antithesis of all of that. His stutter, his aversion to eye contact, his need for rigid routines. To Lambert, these were all signs of weakness and instability. Luca's hope began to erode, replaced by a weary resignation. He tried to adapt. He practiced speeches in the mirror until his jaw ached. He tried to force eye contact, which overwhelmed him so sensorially he could barely think. Each attempt was a failure, leaving him more exhausted and more isolated. The institution he hoped would embrace him for his mind was, in fact, punishing him for it. The pain was deep, not the pain of failure, but the pain of being fundamentally misunderstood. The door that seemed to have opened was, in fact, slowly closing in his face. The conflict that would define Luca's fate, and his nation's, began not with an explosion, but with a whisper in the data. For weeks, Luca had noticed a subtle anomaly in enemy communications. It wasn't the content, but the rhythm. Small fluctuations, pauses, and bursts that didn't match any known protocol. To any other analyst, it would be statistical noise, digital garbage. To Luca, it was music, a chilling symphony that told a story. He worked feverishly, ignoring his assigned tasks. He slept in his cubicle, living on coffee and the adrenaline of discovery. He built a new predictive model from scratch, one that didn't rely on conventional military doctrine, but on chaos theory and cascading systems. The result that emerged from his computer chilled him. The enemy wasn't planning a traditional military attack. They wouldn't target bases, fleets, or battalions. That would be predictable. Instead, Luca's model showed a plan of terrifying audacity, a coordinated surgical strike on seemingly unrelated civilian infrastructure, a water treatment plant in one city, a central power grid node in another, and a key telecommunications tower in a third. Separately, they would be troublesome incidents. Together, at the precise moment, they would create a cascading failure that would cripple the country, generating panic and societal collapse without firing a single shot at a military target. He knew he had to present this. It was the most important discovery of his life. Major Smith, sensing Luca's intensity, secured him an emergency briefing with General Lambert and his staff. The conference room was colder than ever. Luca was prepared. He had rehearsed. He had boiled it down to the essential facts. But when he stood up and saw Lambert's skeptical face, the words snagged again. General, the model, it shows a different kind of a attack. Lambert sighed, an audible sound of pure irritation. Get to the point, doll. Luca took a deep breath, fighting the knot in his throat. They're not going to attack the military. It's a distraction. The T target is C confidence, C civilian infrastructure, the W water network, the P power, the C communications, all at the same time. He pointed to the map on the screen, where 3 red dots pulsed in locations that, to a traditional military man, made no sense at all. It's a cascading failure. One of the colonels, Pierre Ramirez, chuckled softly. With all due respect, that's movie script stuff. The enemy isn't stupid. They attack strength to neutralize strength. Lambert nodded in agreement. He looked at Luca with a mixture of pity and disdain. Doll, we appreciate your creativity, but military strategy is based on centuries of tested principles, not on fanciful theories. You're seeing ghosts in the data. It's not for fantasy. Luca's voice rose in desperation, his stutter worsening. The math proves it. The RR rhythm of the C communications. It's a key code. F for the synchronization. The awkwardness in the room was palpable. Sophia Kauer-Keller, a young analyst sitting in the back, felt a chill crawl up her spine. She had reviewed Luca's raw data. The logic was sound. The math was undeniable. But she was just a junior analyst. Speaking out against a general would be career suicide. She remained silent, hating herself for it. General Lambert rose, ending the discussion. Enough, doll. You are officially off this project. Your obsession with this absurd theory is becoming a waste of resources. Go back to analyzing archives. Perhaps slower, more methodical work is better suited to your temperament. The word temperament was delivered with a tone that left no doubt about its true meaning. The rejection was total and public. It wasn't professional disagreement. It was personal dismissal. Lambert wasn't just rejecting a plan. He was rejecting Luca. He was invalidating his mind, his way of seeing the world. To the general, Luca's difficulty in speaking was a direct reflection of a difficulty in thinking clearly. He couldn't separate the messenger from the message, and in doing so, he threw away the only key that could save them all. Luca walked out of the room, not with anger, but with a cold emptiness in his chest. The human dilemma was clear. Truth, no matter how pure, held no value if the person uttering it was deemed imperfect. Luca's punishment was a slow, silent death. His access to real-time data was revoked. His terminal was reconfigured to handle only historical files. He was transferred to a windowless office in the sub-basement, a place the High Command referred to as the dead file. It was a clear exile, a message to all: do not deviate from the norm. For the first few days, Luca nearly drowned in despair. The noise of the world had won. The humiliation of that meeting replayed in his mind. Every dismissive word from Lambert, every pitying glance. He stopped trying to speak to people, retreating inward. He did the work assigned to him, cataloging reports of battles from decades, passed in with robotic precision, but his mind was elsewhere. It was with his model, with the patterns that continued to scream in his head. The shift didn't come from a grand epiphany, but from a small act of rebellion. One night, alone in the archive, he looked at the dusty reports and noticed something. Even in history, there were patterns. He began using the old data to refine his model, testing it against past conflicts. The theory held. It was universal. The realization calmed him. It was no longer about proving Lambert wrong. It was about the truth of the mathematics itself. The silent turnaround gained an unlikely ally. One night, late, the door to his office creaked open. It was Sophia Kauer-Keller. She looked nervous, clutching a data disk as if it were a bomb. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered, closing the door behind her. Luca just watched her, saying nothing. "I read your full report, the one you couldn't present. The math, the appendices." She paused, taking a deep breath. "I believe you, Luca. It makes terrifying sense. The general is blinded by prejudice." She placed the data disk on his desk. "This is the real-time data feeds. I've created a mirrored access. It's a huge risk for me, but if you're right, someone needs to be prepared." Her gesture was like a beacon in total darkness. For the first time in weeks, Luca didn't feel utterly alone. He looked at Sophia, and in her eyes, there was no pity, only a shared respect for logic. He nodded. A single, small movement. It was enough. They began working in secret, in the deep of night, in the silent sanctuary of the archive. Luca, fueled by the fresh data Sophia brought, refined his model with chilling accuracy. He could now predict not just the what, but the when and the how. He mapped the attack timeline with a margin of error of minutes. The turnaround was no longer about stopping the attack. They knew that was impossible. No one in command would listen to them. The new mission was to mitigate the disaster. If they couldn't stop the avalanche, perhaps they could divert a few stones, save a few lives. They devised a counterplan, a series of small, decentralized actions. They didn't require high command approval. They were simple things: security alerts for infrastructure maintenance crews, suggestions for stress tests for power grid operators, anonymous notes to hospital security chiefs about the importance of testing their backup generators. Sophia used her position to disseminate this information, disguising it as routine bureaucracy. "We're planting lifeboats on a ship everyone believes is unsinkable," she said one night, watching Luca trace the latest projections. Luca didn't reply with words. He just pointed to the screen, to the date and time his model predicted the first domino would fall. Less than 48 hours remained. The silence in the office wasn't one of defeat, but of a tense, determined calm. They had accepted reality and found a new path. It wasn't a path of glory, but of silent responsibility. The real turnaround was this: the shift from wanting to be heard to the need to act, even if no one would ever know it was them. The first siren wailed at 02:14 a.m., precisely 7 minutes before Luca's prediction. The attack had begun. In the Strategic Command Center, chaos was immediate and absolute. The first report came from the capital's water authority, an explosion at a primary pumping station. Before Lambert could process the information, a second report flooded in. A massive blackout across the entire western region, caused by an overload at a central substation. Seconds later, communications faltered. Cell and internet networks became intermittent, then died. The enemy's plan, the cascading failure, was unfolding with brutal beauty. Panic was the primary weapon. But then, something unexpected began to happen. Small, anonymous, disconnected victories began to emerge from the chaos. At the water treatment plant, the chief engineer, a man named Bruno Omar, had received a safety drill memo a week prior, a suggestion from Sophia. The memo instructed him to divert main flow to secondary reservoirs overnight, an unusual practice, but one he'd followed out of sheer bureaucracy. When the main station exploded, the city didn't immediately lose its water. The secondary reservoirs provided vital hours of supply, averting mass panic. A small win. Hundreds of miles away, at the power substation, Supervisor Zoe Durand Souza acted on instinct. She'd read an anonymous technical report planted by Sophia about the grid's vulnerability to synchronized power surges. When the first alarms blared, instead of following the standard protocol that would have led to a cascading collapse, she manually isolated critical sectors, sacrificing industrial areas to save hospitals and emergency services. The blackout was contained. Another small win. On the ground, chaos was contained by islands of preparedness, a logistics. Commander Marco Anderson Jankowski, upon losing communication with Central Command, opened the contingency envelope he'd received from a junior analyst days earlier. Inside was a map with alternate evacuation routes and meeting points that avoided major bridges and tunnels. These were precisely the structures the enemy sabotage teams were targeting. Jankowski's troops managed to protect civilians and establish perimeters because they were operating from a plan that anticipated what the High Command refused to see. Each of these actions was an echo of Luca and Sophia's silent work. They were the lifeboats they had scattered. In the sub-basement, in the archive, Luca and Sophia monitored the events on a fragmented data feed. They felt no elation. Each report of a thwarted attack was also the confirmation of the catastrophe that could have been. The biggest victory was the quietest. The capital's central hospital, housing the president and much of the government in its underground bunker, lost grid power. The emergency protocol kicked in. The generators, however, did not start. A subtle sabotage, a burned-out electronic component. But a chief nurse, Hannah Renault, remembered an insistent email from a security analyst about testing backup of the backup generators, the last resort systems. They had been tested the previous afternoon. She raced to the sub-level and manually activated them. Power returned to the hospital, to the ICUs, to the government bunker. The nation's leadership was saved. In the command center, confusion slowly gave way to a disconcerting bewilderment. The enemy attack, so brilliantly conceived, was failing. It was being thwarted, not by a grand, centralized strategy, but by dozens of small, clever, independent actions. General Lambert watched, stunned, as his officers tried to understand how those field units seemed to be a step ahead of the enemy, without receiving any orders from him. It was Sophia who finally broke the silence. With a steady voice, she approached the general and placed a tablet on his desk. On the screen, Luca's original model, now flashing with green dots where each small victory had occurred. "They're not acting by chance, General," she said. "They're acting according to plan. The plan you rejected." When the dust settled and the morning light revealed a shaken but intact nation, a heavy silence descended upon the command center. The attack had been repelled, not by a spectacular counteroffensive, but because it had disintegrated against a series of prescient, invisible defenses. The truth was now undeniable, and it was projected on every screen. Luca Dahl's simulation, side by side with the actual attack data. They were identical. General Louis Lambert spent hours alone in his office. The door was closed, but anyone passing the hallway could feel the aura of a personal defeat that was deeper than any lost battle. He picked up Luca's original report, the one he'd dismissed with a wave of disdain. He read every word, every line of code, every footnote. The stammered phrases that had irritated him in the conference room now echoed in his mind with the clarity of prophecy. His reflection was a painful journey inward. He hadn't just rejected an analysis. He had rejected a human being because he didn't fit his mold. He had demanded that genius present itself in uniform, with a firm voice and a direct gaze. He had mistaken fluency of speech for clarity of thought. His prejudice, his need for conformity, had nearly cost the nation. The arrogance of his certainty was now a bitter ash in his mouth. It wasn't a miscalculation, it was a failure of character, and the weight of that realization was crushing. Meanwhile, in the archive, Luca sat before his now darkened screen. The work was done. He felt no triumph, no pleasure in saying, "I told you so." He felt only a profound weariness that came from the soul. The validation of his mind had come at the cost of a national crisis. He felt a silent sadness for a world that needed a near catastrophe to finally listen. Sophia found him there, in the dim light. She brought 2 cups of coffee, placing one on his desk. "You did it, Luca. You saved them." He looked at her, his face expressionless, but his eyes held an ocean of emotion. He just nodded. The victory was real, but the scar of rejection would remain. He knew that no matter how much things changed, a part of him would always remember what it was like to be a voice, screaming truth into a soundproof room. The most profound transformation wasn't in the country's defense systems, but in the hearts and minds of those who witnessed it. Officers who had once scoffed at Luca now spoke of his model with near mystical reverence. They didn't understand how his mind worked, but they finally respected its results. Later that day, Lambert summoned Luca and Sophia to his office. The general looked older, diminished. He didn't sit behind his large desk. He stood, in the middle of the room, vulnerable. "Dahl," he began, his voice rough. "There's no easy way to say this. I was wrong. Completely, dangerously wrong." He paused, looking directly at Luca, and for the first time, his gaze held no judgment, only a reluctant, genuine respect. "Your work, your mind, I didn't understand it. And because of my failure, we almost all failed. There is no excuse for what I did. There is only the truth." Luca remained silent, listening. It was more than he expected, more than he thought he needed. The acceptance, when it finally came, was quiet and solemn, not a burst of fireworks. It was the acknowledgement that his unique perspective was not a flaw to be corrected, but a strength to be utilized. The pain of invisibility was beginning to give way to a new, fragile sense of belonging. Weeks later, the conference room where Luca had been humiliated was readied for a ceremony. It wasn't an event for the press or the public. It was an internal reckoning. The entire staff was present. Luca was there, his mother, Helena, seated discreetly in the back. He wore a suit, feeling out of place, but present. General Louis Lambert stepped up to the podium. There was no arrogance in his posture. He looked like a man who had faced his own failure and survived, transformed. "We celebrate victories on battlefields," he began, his voice echoing in the silent room. "But today we acknowledge a victory that was won not with weapons, but with intellect. A victory we nearly lost, not because of the enemy's strength, but because of our own weakness. My weakness." He turned and looked directly at Luca. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Luca Dahl." His analysis predicted last night's attack with absolute accuracy. His counterplan, developed in secret after I foolishly rejected it, saved countless lives and prevented the collapse of our nation. A murmur swept through the room. Lambert raised his hand, signaling for silence. "I rejected Mr. Dahl because he did not communicate in the way I expected. I mistook his difficulty in speaking for an inability to think. It was the greatest mistake of my career, and possibly of this country's recent history." He paused, and the room held its breath. "Mr. Dahl, on behalf of a grateful nation, and from the depths of my own profound regret, I apologize." Lambert stepped down from the podium and walked towards Luca. He extended his hand. Luca hesitated for a moment, then slowly shook the general's hand. It wasn't a gesture of total forgiveness, but of a new beginning. "Apologies are not enough," Lambert continued, turning back to his officers. "Apologies don't fix systemic failures. Starting today, I am announcing the creation of a new unit, the Asymmetric Strategic Analysis Division. This unit will operate outside the traditional chain of command. Its sole purpose will be to challenge our assumptions, to find the patterns we don't see, and to prepare us for the unthinkable. It will be built around Mr. Dahl's methods and perspective. He looked at Luca again, and he will be its first director. It is not a request, Mr. Dahl. It is a strategic necessity. All eyes turned to Luca. The weight of that moment, of that offer, was immense. He felt his mother's gaze on his back, a mixture of pride and apprehension. All his life he had wanted to be heard. Now, they were giving him the country's most powerful megaphone. He took a deep breath, feeling the words form. The world waited. "Oh, okay," he said, the word coming out with a slight stumble but with unmistakable clarity. He raised his chin, meeting the general's gaze. Let's get to work." In that moment, his stutter was not a sign of weakness. It was a testament to his resilience. It was the sound of a voice that refused to be silenced. Helena, in the back of the room, let a single tear trace a path down her cheek. It was not a tear of sadness, but of a hope she thought she had lost forever. The pain of the past had not magically disappeared. The scars were still there, but now, for the first time, there were real tools to build the future. There was respect. There was a place for him, and that was more than a victory. It was justice. The brightest minds often do not shout. They whisper truths in a language the world has yet to learn to hear. Luca's story reminds us that true power lies not in conformity, but in the courage to embrace different perspectives. If this story touched you in any way, if it made you think about those voices we might be ignoring in our own lives, please like, comment, and subscribe. Someone, somewhere, might desperately need to hear this today.